Hello YouTubers, Michael Scott, Scotty Man Photo. Thought I'd talk a little bit today about how I set up my camera for landscape photography. So to start, I think it depends on your own situation. I know everybody says that, but the truth is, I think when you get a new camera, if you're like me, you'll scour around YouTube a little bit and look at what kind of some of the other folks are doing with their camera, and I think that's a good guide. But really and truly, what determines what sets up your camera is your own experiences, the lessons learned, so to speak. So to get into some of the specifics of it, and I would talk about first, is the back button focus. So for landscape photography, the back button focus really allows me to focus on a subject, and then I can just release my finger off the back button, and I don't have to worry about when I go to take a picture, whether I do it with the shutter release on the camera or whether I use my remote shutter release, I don't have to refocus. So sometimes, and especially for me, photographing early in the mornings or late in the evenings, you might have some difficulty pulling focus with low light situations. So when you get focus, you don't want to mess with it. So back button, I can focus, and then once I let my finger go, that's it, I'm focused. I don't have to take my lens and switch it to manual or switch my camera to manual to prevent any accidental focusing. So I think that's one of the most important things that I learned in landscape photography, was using back button focus. There's a number of tutorials on YouTube that'll teach you how to do that. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of it. So moving on, a couple of other things that really are beneficial. The depth of field preview button, although this was really nice on SLRs in the film days, because you really couldn't view your image and you really had no way to check your depth of field, but the depth of field preview basically stops down the lens so that you get an idea of what your depth of field is. And on a DSLR today, I don't need it. I really can check my depth of field on the back of my LCD, so I don't use that button. But what I do is I've changed that in the settings, the function settings on the controls, to actually allow me to scroll through my aspect ratios, because I do like to shoot in different aspect ratios, and I like to do that in the field. You can shoot at the native aspect ratio 3:2 in this camera full frame, and you can get back in post-processing. You can crop the image to the way you want with the aspect ratio the way you want. But there's just something about being in the field. And when I switch the camera to that specific aspect ratio, it allows me to really frame up the image as I really intend it to be. And I think it really helps me in post-processing and eliminates distractions. So for me, it really works, and that's why I use that. One of the other buttons, I think it's the function 2 button on the bottom, this one here. What I do is I really use that one so I can switch on and off the horizon leveling. Because when I'm shooting landscapes, I always try to level my camera so that regardless of what the scene looks like, but I want my camera level. And I use this button, I just tap on that, and I get that horizon leveling, and I can see where I'm at. You can actually view it in live view, or you can see it by looking in the viewfinder, the optical viewfinder. You'll see a couple of arrows that point, and you can get your camera aligned level. That way, when I'm back in post-processing, I actually know that the image was level. So if there's any straightening that goes on, I know I started out level. So, yeah. So my exposure control settings are pretty simple. I'll leave my camera on manual. That doesn't mean that I don't switch between shutter priority or aperture priority, and I do that often, but for the most part, I'm shooting in manual. And I've mentioned that before in another video, and I'll link to that here, why I shoot in manual mode. But basically, it just gives me more control over the camera and all the settings. Some of the other things are my ISO. I always leave that to the native setting. Some lessons learned that if you're shooting in higher ISO situations where maybe you're set to 1200, and if you don't put that back when you're done, sometimes, I'm guilty of it too, you might pull out your camera, start shooting away and not realizing where your ISO settings are. So I always put that back to the native, and then I adjust from there in the field where I need to be. Got some notes here so I don't miss anything. Shutter speed, of course, is as required depending on the situation, and that changes to whatever it needs to be. And the aperture settings, one thing I would note is that I try to shoot most of my images as a landscape photographer are around f8. And although there are times when that differs, but f8 to f13 is really where I choose to stay at. And I've just found with all my lenses, and that f8 tends to be about the right setting, f8 to f13, depending on the depth of field that I need. I have gone f16 on occasion, and I don't really see any issues with diffraction. Diffraction is always a big issue. If you don't know what diffraction is, I won't get into the specifics of it, but basically it's a blurring of the image caused by the way the light enters through a small opening in the lens. So the more you stop down your lens, the more diffraction that you can possibly enter. So I haven't really noticed any diffraction, any noticeable diffraction on f16 or below. But when you really start stopping a lens down all the way, that's when you start to see some softening in the image, a slight blur to the image. So it can affect your overall image. So I tend to stay at f13 to f8, somewhere around that range, depending on the situation. So another setting is RAW. I shoot in RAW, and the reason I shoot in RAW is, and you can Google this, I mean, it's all over the internet, but I shoot in RAW because I have more control over the images. And if you don't know what RAW is, you can certainly find plenty of YouTube tutorials out there about shooting in RAW. But I highly recommend shooting in RAW because what RAW is just, it captures as much data as that you can possibly get from a scene, and you take it back with you to your computer, and you just have more information available to process your image. If you shoot it in a JPEG format, you get back, those settings are baked in, and I don't do baked in images. And when they're baked in, it makes it hard to, you can do it, but there's a loss on the image when you change white balance or other settings. So RAW captures the data and allows you to take that back to your processing software and really get the most out of it. So that's why I shoot in RAW with no JPEG. All right, in addition to shooting RAW, I set my camera to shoot lossless compressed at 14-bit. There's a lot of information on the web about whether you should shoot compressed or uncompressed, but the bottom line is what Nikon does is it uses an algorithm on its lossless compressed images to it makes the file smaller, but when it unpacks, the information is still there, so you're not losing any data. So, and I've done a lot of research on this, and I think that a lossless compressed image, at least for me, and 14 bits is the way to go. And the 14 bits basically gives me more tones to play with. And as I mentioned, shooting in RAW at 14-bit, that allows me to have full control and get the colors and everything just right in the way I want the image. And really, there's not a lot of difference in size between 12-bit and 14-bit. So these files are huge in this D850 anyway. So, but the difference between an uncompressed file and a lossless compressed file is basically, I mean, you're talking about a 90 megapixel image on an uncompressed image versus maybe a 45 megapixel image on a lossless compressed. That's pretty significant in storage. So yeah, something to think about. Well, another consideration is color space. I leave my camera set to sRGB, and the truth is I shoot in RAW, as I mentioned earlier, and so the color space isn't baked into the camera, so it really doesn't matter. So in your post-processing software, you can put it in whatever color space it needs to be in and view it however you want to view it. So for me, I think I've been shooting in sRGB forever, and that's the way my camera displays an image, and it works out fine for me, so I don't worry too much about color space. On Nikon cameras, you have some picture control settings that you can choose. And for me, I set my camera to standard. Now, as I mentioned, shooting in RAW, these things aren't baked in, so this has no effect on a RAW image. But what it does have an effect on is how I view the image on the LCD. So I set it to standard because I just know it's always the same, And when I'm viewing the image in the field, I just want a rough idea of what my image is going to look like. And I realize that the colors, the tonality of the image is going to be different when I get back in post-processing, and I have much more control over that. So standard is just a way of viewing your image on the LCD for me. I set my white balance to auto in my camera. There's a couple of options I have. It's auto and auto 1 and 2, and basically that allows you to kind of warm up your image or not. And it really doesn't matter what you set your white balance to when you're shooting RAW, because white balance is not affected. It doesn't change the RAW image. You can select any white balance you want, change it in any way you want back in post-processing. But the white balance setting does affect the way you view the image on the LCD. So I set my white balance to auto, and I typically get the best results with that. So another setting that I think is super important to talk about is long exposure noise reduction. That setting does affect RAW images, and I prefer it. I like to leave it on. You may not want it on, and there's reasons why you might turn it off. If you're doing some astrophotography, you might want to leave it off, and here's why. Basically, the camera takes 2 images. So if you have a 30-second exposure, it's going to take another 30-second exposure. So it captures one 30-second exposure, and then the camera captures another with the shutter closed. And what that does is it basically captures a dark image. Because what the camera is doing, or what's actually happening is the sensor in long exposure gets hot, and it creates these specks, little white spots in your image, colored spots on the image. They can be easily removed in post-processing software. But the thing is that that's great, but I prefer to do it in the field, because when the camera takes that second image, it will then compare the first image and then the image with the shutter closed, and it will automatically remove the hot pixels for you. It's a lot less work in Photoshop. And that's why I do it. So I prefer long exposure noise reduction on. And it really depends on you. You can turn it off. Occasionally I'll turn it off if I'm doing some very long exposures, and it just saves time out in the field, but it's a trade-off either way. Well, one of the other things I talk about is metering mode. So I leave my camera typically set in matrix metering. Basically, that's overall evaluation of the scene. And it doesn't really matter in post-processing to a raw image what you set that to, but it does matter on how you capture the image and where your highlights and shadows are. So I think, long story short, I've just been shooting in matrix mode for a long time, and I think I stick with it. But I do occasionally, if I want to really measure the highlights, or if I got a high dynamic range situation where I got really strong highlights, really deep dark areas in the shadows, and I can switch to spot metering. And basically, instead of evaluating the whole scene, it gets a little bit narrower. It gets down to a smaller area that you can select and evaluate. And for example, if I wanted to see what the difference is between the highlights and shadows, I could go to spot metering, meter the sky, and then meter an area of the image that I want to retain detail in but has dark shadows. And that will give me that dynamic range. So I might realize that I've got a 6-stop situation. So, but for the most part, I leave my camera set in matrix metering. Okay, so your memory card settings are important too. Now, this camera has 2 memory cards, and in the settings, it allows me to choose how I want those memory cards to perform. For example, I could have my primary card, great, I'm shooting images, and my secondary card is used as a backup, or an overflow, if you will. So I fill my first card up, my second card just continues on. But actually, for me, as a landscape photographer, I think that's not the best way. The best way is to have your primary card capturing images and your secondary card capture backups. So, I might go out and only capture 4 or 5 images, maybe 1 or 2. And I don't really use I've never filled a memory card up. So, but that might not be your situation. You might be filling memory cards up. You might want to use the other one as an overflow. But for me, the backup is what's important. I'm, knock on wood, I've never had a corrupted card, but if I did, I would sure like to have that backup. And so that's why I set the secondary card as the backup. All right, focusing. Focusing's super important. So as far as the camera goes, I have my camera set on, basic setup is automatic focus on single point. So you can set your camera on multiple points or to focus on a single point. But that single point allows me to precisely focus where I want and maintain more control over that. And that's why I set my camera to AFS, single point. Okay, a couple of other things on the camera itself that I have. One is the Eyecup. Now, you may prefer other options, but I like the Eyecup. And you can see that there. Basically, the Eyecup allows me to really kind of darken, eliminate any of the outside distractions. It really darkens up everything, so I'm just actually seeing the image and no other light sources coming in. And if you're an LCD shooter, then you know the Eyecup's not going to matter for you. But I prefer the Eyecup. So you know, it kind of flips back. I mean, it's just the most versatile. But anyway, yeah, beneficial to me. Another thing I have on the camera is this little strap. And you may be wondering what that is, but actually what it is it attaches to this little lanyard that I have on my remote shutter release. And I put that on there because several years ago on a D800, I was attaching my cable release and I actually snagged it and kind of destroyed the socket here. So yeah, I had to send it in for repair. But so attaching the lanyard on here really, I can just get this attached here real quick. Yeah, sorry about that. But attaching the lanyard on there really allows me to, you know, pull on the lanyard instead of actually pulling on the cable release. So if I should snag it, or you know, it just hangs, it's supported by the camera, and I think that's a super handy little tool. So some other things on the camera itself, I always use L brackets with a quick release, or excuse me, a QD for QD straps. So basically, if I want to sling my camera, I can, and I can attach my QD strap. These are made by Really Right Stuff, very bulky, handy. Not the lightest strap in the world, but nevertheless, it is great because you can just really click that in your camera, and it is very secure way of carrying your camera. Then you can just sling your strap around or around your shoulder or however you wear it. But yeah, really, really handy. So these L brackets are super handy, and they also provide you a way of, as I mentioned, I use tripod a lot, so they also provide you a way of placing this in your tripod in horizontal and portrait mode without having to, you know, shift your tripod around, and just gives you more options and versatility. And these little things in the field, yeah, they save time, and they allow you to focus on capturing the image and not kind of messing and fussing with your camera. So yeah, just some options that you might find beneficial. Well, in summary, I would say this: the settings that you have in these cameras, it just depends on you. I mean, these are some ideas and recommendations that I have based on my own experiences, but you may find that other things work better for you. So I would say concentrate on the image and not so much on what settings or how to set up your camera, because really and truly, the setup in your camera is not going to make a better image. It may save time, it may help you in the field, and it may help you when you get back in post-processing, but there are some things that are super important, like shooting in RAW. I really recommend that. But you know, if you're not into the post-processing and you want the quickest path to everything, and you find that you don't need to do a lot of work with your images, shooting JPEGs might be the way to go for you. So some of these settings in here are really subjective as far as your style of photography, and and how much time you want to put into it in the field or in post-processing. So just make a long story short, it's up to you, the settings that you put in here. But and there's a lot of information in these cameras and a lot of customization you can do, and it's just information overload. So I would say if you're new, take your camera, go out in the field and shoot and learn as you go. And you know, there's some good YouTube videos, maybe this one's one, that you can you know, kind of pull up and maybe get some ideas of how to get started. But and hopefully that was my goal, was really just kind of give you some ideas on how to get started, and maybe a good way of setting up your camera initially and then growing from that. So I hope I was able to do that. Well, I'm going to go ahead and end the video, but hey, if you liked the video, make sure you hit that like button and consider subscribing. Drop me a comment. Let me know what you thought. And as always, if I don't see you down the road, maybe I'll see you on the trail.